Alright, what's up my channel? It's your friendly neighborhood Sassyblondewriter. I have a different little setup that I'm doing for you guys and I hope you enjoy it. If you are new here, welcome. Please like and subscribe if you enjoy this video. I do a smattering of stuff. We do a little bit of dev diaries, we do a little bit of vlogs, we do a little bit of just breaking down tropes and different writing concepts, and that's what I'm here doing today. So I wanted to try this because I've noticed that I really enjoy doing these like talking about different writing stuff, kind of like the teachery moments, talking about things like diction or syntax and breaking down different conventions of genres like parts of a mystery and that sort of thing. And so filming in front of my wall doesn't really lend itself to that, especially since I ended up doing a lot of the typey stuff on the computer anyway to make it so people could take notes if they wanted to. So I figured just cut out the middleman and do it like this. So here is the Sassyblondewriter, new and possibly improved. We'll find out. Today, of course, like I said, we are doing a writer's craft chat and we are talking about diction in literature. So the reason why I explain that diction in literature and not something else is because diction actually has multiple meanings. The two that I know off the top of my head are in literature, where diction refers to word choice, and the other one, which is diction in regards to singing, because I am a classically trained singer, that refers to how well you pronounce the word so people can understand it. So for these purposes, we are going to be using diction in literature, just so that way nobody gets confused. So the first question you're probably wondering is, what is diction and why are we talking about it? So to put it simply, like I was saying before, diction, when it's in literature, is the words the writer chooses to convey a particular meaning or tone. So in both writing and speech, specifically rhetoric, words are selected based on the audience, the reader, or the listener, depending on what form or the viewer, depending on which medium you are using to convey your message. So the writer decides on the level of diction that is appropriate for that specific audience. So an easy way to think about this is a writer wouldn't write to a bunch of college students or professors the way they would for your thesis defense for an advanced degree, the same way you would write a picture book on maybe the same topic for a bunch of kindergartners. You just don't do it. And that even furthermore for depending on your geographic area, what kind of jargon are you going to use? Are you going to use different colloquialisms? Are you going to use slang and that sort of thing? So diction, it's funny because you don't really talk about it unless you're in like a more advanced rhetoric or English type of class, but diction is actually really important because that's how you figure out the author's purpose and the audience that they were going for. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. The next question you're probably wondering is, why should I know what diction is? And the reason why are, we are going to go with three that I can think of off the top of my head. So the first one would be tone consistency. So one of the most common reasons why people don't like a book is because the tone is inconsistent. The more you are aware you are of your word choice, the better your writing is going to be. A lot of times, it's because the writer goes from talking to the audience as more of a friend to all of a sudden being very formal with them without a clear choice on like why the character is doing that. So this is really good, especially if you're working in a first person narrator, which is what I tend to do, because then it helps if you're not consistent with your tone, then it kind of sounds like you switch characters without telling anybody, and that can help you figure out some potential issues in your manuscript. The second reason why we're talking about this is because it really helps with developing your character and your setting. The use of jargon, which are terms specific to a type of industry, so like anything from film industry to law jargon or business jargon or even education jargon as well. Those are all different things to consider when you are writing something, because that'll help, that will make the audience kind of select itself. For example, I am not a business person, I am not a finance person or a lawyer by trade, and so naturally if I start reading something that uses a bunch of different legalese or different business terms, I'm probably going to pass it along to somebody who actually uses those terms in everyday life or knows what they are better than I would necessarily. Or it helps me figure out, oh, they're not talking about me, so I don't have to worry about it. Then you also have slang, which is specific to a social group or a specific age group, depending on how you want to divide those things up. So you got your millennials, your Gen Zs, your baby boomers, the greatest generation. Those are all age groups. And then you have social groups, like the slang that a slam poet uses is not going to be the same as somebody who's a DJ. So it's important to keep that in mind. What slang would your character know or not know, depending on what they're doing? And then you have colloquialisms, which are specific to a geographical area. So, for example, if your character is originally from New England, they would probably say, "Hey, it's wicked cold here." Then they'd have an accent, right? But if your character is from Spain, they'd probably talk differently than necessarily somebody from Florida, or the other way around. So colloquialisms can help you establish where your character is originally from, because a lot of times saying things like the bubbler instead of the water fountain, those habits die hard. Or saying y'all instead of you guys would help establish a character's background. If they're the odd one out, be like, oh, sorry, old habits die hard. They do that a lot in Ted Lasso. But it also helps you establish current setting as well. And last but certainly not least, the third reason, which is the one that I also keep bringing up unintentionally, is you should know what diction is because of your audience. Your audience is whoever you are writing to and your relationship to them. So your choice of words establishes the point of view, the relationship to the audience, the reason you're writing. If you're writing an academic paper, you're not going to phrase it the same way you would writing a really long text about some drama that went down in your friend group. So there is a lot of dispute on the internet, as I learned researching for this video, on how many different types of diction there are. So here's all of them, and I tried to kind of group them together with what I think is kind of a good overview for them. So our main categories, you got formal diction and informal diction, then you have abstract, concrete, and poetic. So the subgroup of formal is pedantic, which we'll go over in a little bit, and then we have informal, which the subgroups would be pedestrian, slang, and colloquial, which we sort of went over already. So those are the ones we will be dealing with. Some places or some schools of thought are just formal and informal, and everything else is subgroups. Some schools of thought are all their different types, but even though informal is kind of relevant to kind of envelope for kind of an umbrella for pedestrian, slang, and colloquial. So here are the definitions. You decide how many types there are, because I won't. So the first one we're going to talk about is formal diction. So there's no slang, no colloquialisms, not really so much personal pronouns or contractions. Instead of saying you can't, you say you cannot. This is actually something that a college professor tried to call me out on once. Still bitter about it, but anyway, so oftentimes you find it in professional text, in big business documents, legal papers, college papers, academia. Why is it used? It establishes a very formal relationship with the audience. So an example of using formal diction for the scenario would be your main character just found out their nemesis is telling lies about drama that went down, and they must respond to these accusations. So to use formal diction, you would say, I will address this issue right away. That's it. No fuss, no lollygagging around, just short, sweet, and to the point, but still respectful and businesslike. Then for me, I have the subgroup of pedantic diction underneath formal diction, but obviously it doesn't really matter what types there are, more that there are different types. So pedantic is when a writer is highly detailed or very academic in their writing. Words are chosen specifically to convey only one meaning. There's really no room for interpretation. So sometimes it's used in literature, a lot more times it's used in academia, but sometimes it's used in a book when the characters speak in a highly educated and very highfalutin manner. I tend to think of this as using purple prose as well, like in F. Scott Fitzgerald, The Great Gatsby. So why would you use it? Figure out character development, establish the purpose of the story. It says a lot about the different characters in The Great Gatsby, that they're kind of putting on this facade of being very deep and intellectual or very educated when they're all just people. So an example of using pedantic diction for that same main character nemesis responding to lies situation would be an examination of your stance. I have identified some critical areas that I will now expound upon. Then on the other side of things, you have informal diction. So this is, again, I consider an umbrella for some of the other ones that we're going to be talking about, but obviously that distinction is really neither here nor there. But anyway, so informal diction is the way you talk to people closest to you as opposed to strangers or work colleagues. So it's the best in casual situations. So you probably noticed that I'm using pretty informal diction when I talk on my channel. A lot of YouTubers do that to kind of create this sense of camaraderie and make the audience feel like this is really super chill and laid back. You're not getting graded on any of this. It's also probably your favorite professor or teacher talks to you as well, is very informally. So why would you use it when you are writing? It gives a lighter tone and makes the piece more down to earth and less lofty and highfalutin. So another example of using informal diction when you're dealing with your nemesis's lies would be like, no way, that's not true at all. Then you have pedestrian language, which again is kind of like informal language, and then you're going to take that up a couple notches. So pedestrian diction is when something is written the way people normally speak to anyone off the street. So aka any pedestrian coming through. It's how they were, it's how people with technical knowledge would explain something to people without any of that knowledge. So a lot of times lawyers specifically put it in layman's terms. So it's the type of diction that is used by politicians when speaking to diverse crowds. So why would you use it? Basically, it's the opposite reason why someone would use pedantic diction. So if they're trying to sound smart and using pedantic diction, like everybody in The Great Gatsby does, then pedestrian diction is trying to sound normal or common and kind of relate to people. So instead of trying to sound pretentious, it sounds super relatable. And the example of pedestrian diction for the nemesis lie response would be, a pedestrian response would be, I understand what you're saying, but there's something very important you're missing here. And then that's it. Then you have slang and colloquial diction. I feel like I've gone through what these are a lot in passing, but slang is an extension of informal diction where words and phrases that a particular type of person, like a Gen Zer or a millennial, would understand better than somebody outside of those groups. And then colloquial, it's kind of the same thing. Similar to slang, but just with specific geographic types of areas. So colloquial diction also represents different dialects of language. So so remember, there's different types of language as well. There is Canadian French versus Belgian French, and then there is Spain Spanish versus Latin American Spanish, and all of that fun stuff. And then there's also just different grammar rules for different dialects as well. So something to keep in mind. So an example of a slang response would be, "Fam, this dude is capping, I did not do it." And a colloquial colloquial diction would be, "Sounds like you've loaded the wrong wagon with that one there." Abstract diction is kind of its own thing. It's really neither formal or informal. It's kind of its own separate thing, which is why we're talking about it right now. It discusses something intangible like an idea or emotion. So it's hard to put abstract thoughts into words. So a lot of times abstract diction comes across very vague or ambiguous, like just saying war is a bad time. And would you like to expand? No. So and it's kind of like that. So an example with the nemesis causing drama, an abstract diction would just be like, what they're saying isn't right, or it doesn't feel right. And so whenever I think of abstract diction, I kind of imagine like a devil's advocate just being like, and could you explain more? Concrete diction is also its own type of thing, and it's basically the opposite of abstract diction because it uses specific and direct language with minimal ambiguity. I always think of using concrete diction when you're trying to make something idiot-proof, because you want to be as clear as possible and leave no room for interpretation. So a lot of times it's just describing things as they are. That building is crumbly. Adhering to proper definitions of words and citing really only the facts. So an example of that with the whole nemesis situation would be, I understand that you believe you are correct, but you are missing a necessary piece of information. So that would be concrete. Then we have poetic diction, which kind of bridges abstract and concrete diction together. Poetic diction makes use of rhyme, rhythm, and phonetics to make words sound pleasing together. So a lot of times it feels out of place in everyday speech and writing. It's a necessary element of many creative outlets like poetry, song lyrics, rap, and to some extent speech writing as well. I was going to say something, I forgot. For example, in Midsummer Night's Dream, Shakespeare specifically goes between concrete diction and poetic diction to show the differences between the working class people like Bottom and the acting troupe and the fancy pants fairy gods or whatever they are. So if you're using poetic diction for a character in that situation with the nemesis and everything, poetic diction response would be, "What a foolish and ignorant thing you just said. I turn my cheek like that of the moon," or something like that. So now let's kind of put this all together and figure out how it applies to your writing. So here are the types of diction and the examples right here back to back. So the reason we're talking about this is because using different types of diction and keeping it consistent with your point of view really levels up your writing, and we have all that stuff with the audience and that sort of thing. So what you don't necessarily need to know the definition, but it really is helpful when you know what you are talking about. So, for example, if I was going to pick one of these options, I'm going to pick one of these options and try to figure out what type of character it would go with. So, if I was writing a poet character, they would probably use a lot of poetic diction. If I was writing a business resume, I would probably use formal, or if I'm really trying to impress people, pedantic diction. But if I'm trying to write a book that people really connect to and they feel like a sense of camaraderie with the main character, I would probably use informal diction or pedestrian diction, because I don't want to alienate my characters or my audience by using words that they don't necessarily understand because they don't know the slang or they don't know the jargon or they don't know the colloquialisms. If I was trying to write a character like Amelia Bedelia, who's very literal in everything that she does, I would probably use concrete diction, because abstract diction with someone like Amelia Bedelia wouldn't really make much sense, because that's not really one with her character, if that makes any sense. Here are all my sources for today's video. If you are a rhetoric or grammar nerd like yours truly, they can be really helpful for identifying different problems that maybe arise or things that your editor might be talking to you about while you are drafting. That's all I got for you today, folks. I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any other rhetorical devices or any little fun tidbits on diction that you want to add, please drop it in the comments below, and I hope we get to have a little discussion on this. Stay sassy and keep writing.